Why did we let the Russians capture Berlin instead of capturing for ourselves and using it as bragging rights? We had kind of established this idea earlier in 1944 at what was called the Yalta Conference, sensing that the war was going to inevitably end and that the Allies were inevitably going to be successful. FDR, who's in the middle, Stalin, and Churchill all sat down and had basically worked out a framework of what should happen when the war ends. And one of those decisions was that the Russians would be allowed to capture Berlin because of all the things that Germany had done to them specifically. The other part of the Yalta Conference was, okay, and what are we going to do about Germany after the war? And the decision was made that Germany would be partitioned or divided into four occupation zones, like these four spheres of influence. So the entire country is going to be chunked out into four, with us, France, Britain, and Russia each getting a nugget. And the city of Berlin itself happened to be in the Russian nugget, and so it made sense to let them go ahead and capture it since they were going to get to control it. So the war ends. The German forces officially surrender, like everything is finalized paperwork-wise and everything else, on May 8th, 1945. And so this becomes known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. The war in Europe, as you can see from the people pixelatedly celebrating, the war in Europe is done. Keeping in mind that the war in Asia is still going on, but at least half of World War II is done on May 8th, 1945. The cost of the war, approximately $1 trillion, although it's next to impossible to actually determine the cost. And then, like we said at the start, the historic ruling powers lost most of their empires. Britain, France, everybody was so badly destroyed, and the US and USSR come out on top. We are the new superpowers in the world, and eventually Europe is going to be divided between those who prefer the US and those who prefer or are forced to prefer the Russians. We are more favored in Western Europe, and Russia gets what's called the Eastern Bloc countries, which are going to be East Germany, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, all those countries kind of bordering it. Right after the war, we're going to meet to figure out exactly what to do. It's going to be kind of like the Treaty of Versailles process again. At this point, FDR had had a stroke and had passed away, so his vice president, Harry Truman, had taken over. So at Potsdam, you have Truman, Churchill, and Stalin, and they are going to meet to determine Germany's fate. This is where they're going to iron out exactly how much land Germany is going to lose. This map shows kind of the general deterioration and gain of Germany itself. And ultimately, Germany is split into the four spheres. The map is actually created at Potsdam. So the Russians control this side of Germany, the British, the French, and the Americans. Eventually, British, French, and American sides are going to join, and this becomes known as West Germany, and this becomes known as East Germany. And the two Germanys are going to be completely separate countries really into the early 1990s. The city of Berlin, which you see here, is actually the four different dots because the city itself was divided. The western side became the capital for Western Germany. Obviously, having your capital so far removed from your country itself is going to cause a lot of conflicts. And as the Cold War heats up between us and the Soviet Union, it's going to result in our side of Berlin not being safe, and that's where the Berlin Wall will be built. So we'll be talking about all that stuff in the upcoming weeks. It became clear that after this, we were going to have a permanent role in Europe. We create what's called the Marshall Plan, where we decide to give money back to Europe to help them to rebuild. So unlike World War I, where the solution was, oh, just make Germany pay a bunch of fines, we basically, since we realized we were the strongest, gave, the idea was lent, a whole bunch of money to the European countries, and this is going to prevent another Great Depression from setting in. It eventually gets modified that we're only going to give money to those countries actively fighting communists, so not Russia and Russia's friends. That becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, but that's the birth of the Cold War. NATO is also created, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I refer to this as kind of the Kroger Plus card. The idea was that if you were in NATO, you got deals and discounts on trade and also on military friendships. The unexpressed goal however, was to keep America in Europe, the Russians out of Europe, and the Germans down in Europe. And NATO still exists to this day. Obviously, that's not so much the goal anymore, and it is more of a trade agreement. And it's this whole, we are all going to be friends. It's kind of keep an eye on the world together. But it is important to note that this really delineates that we will no longer be friends with Russia. Why are we suddenly against the Soviets? If the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and you get rid of that enemy, well, now you can focus on who your true enemy is, which were the Soviets. We didn't like that they indiscriminately killed people. We didn't like that they were just as cruel to their own people as Hitler ever was. Stalin was very, very, oppressive, like we talked about. And you had this communist government that was doing really cruel things, and so that's where we come to hate communism even more so. Hitler's dead, Germany's defeated, but what about Japan? In America, it's important to note that we did not treat Japanese Americans very well during the war. After Pearl Harbor and throughout the rest of World War II, we're going to create what are called internment camps, where we locked up anybody who looked like they might be Japanese Americans. We said it was for their own safety because we didn't want them to be victims of hate crimes. However, in reality, it was probably that there was an element of racism, and we might have feared that they were spying on us as well. Afterwards, we do wind up reimbursing them for the time spent in these camps. So, when we left off with our discussion of the fighting in the Pacific, we left off with us having won at Midway and going on the offensive. Our ultimate goal is reach Japan. So, MacArthur is going to take charge of all of our troops in the Pacific, and he's going to engage in island hopping, the same strategy that the Japanese have been using to try to get us into Japan. So the first of our offensive battles is going to be Guadalcanal, which was actually fought on what are called the Solomon Islands. This is on August 7th, 1942. The Japanese call it the Island of Death because 23,000 Japanese were killed in this one day alone with this jungle fighting. We were so geared up, I guess you want to say, because we were on the offensive. There were, however, a lot of diseases that both us and the Japanese suffered because of the number of mosquitoes in the jungle fighting. It also caused what we call jungle rot. It's like trench foot. Your foot was so wet all the time. It's kind of like a gangrene type of infection. Nonetheless, in February of 1943, we called the island secure. We said that we had controlled it and that the Japanese were not going to be able to take it, and so we moved on to the next island. And here's our pictures from Guadalcanal. The next major battle is going to be the Tarawa Atoll, which is also known as Batio Island. This is just a 76-hour battle, so very short. We got there, and the Japanese, this is one that they had gone to expecting us to go to also. So they were there first, and they had dug into the ground like trench warfare. We were not prepared for this, so around 3,000 Marines were killed in this one day. And that's about a quarter of all the soldiers that we sent in. So we called this Bloody Tarawa. Nonetheless, we are going to wind up winning this as well. We do wind up skipping some of the smaller islands, and one of the stories that comes out is that the Japanese, because they didn't know which islands we would and wouldn't go to, they had actually gone to islands that we never go to, and no word is ever gotten to these soldiers that the war ends. In the 1970s, National Geographic was going around, and they were doing, like pictorials on these tropical islands, and they run into these World War II Japanese soldiers 30 years later, still sitting, waiting, ready for the war, Americans to arrive to kill them and everything. So to try to explain to these soldiers, the war's been done for 30 years, and we're actually friends now. That had to be a huge, huge blow to their morale, and just, it would be so weird to try to think about. Regardless, there are a lot of other battles where the Japanese had predicted correctly, and they were waiting for us, and we were waiting for them. Battle of Saipan, in this one, there were Japanese babies and mothers who committed suicide. They jumped off of cliffs because this was a Japanese territory, and they didn't want to fall hands to the U.S. Battle of Guam, very bloody. It was a U.S. territory, so obviously, we had a lot of American presence there as well. America won both of these. MacArthur makes it back to the Philippines, as he said. I shall return. He did. He freed them. Iwo Jima, probably one of the more famous ones. There's lots of movies about this. Also known as the Sulphur Island. It was volcanic. We needed this because we needed an emergency landing strip for B-29s as they started to run out of fuel trying to cross the Pacific. Um, so to create these landing strips, we wound up bulldozing Japanese troops into caves, and that's how many of the Japanese troops perished. Um, Probably the most well-known incident, although again there's controversy with this, is that a group of Marines climbed the highest point of the island, which is Mount Suribachi, and they threw the flag down into the ground, they thrust it down, and this picture was taken, and it became front page news, and it was this whole symbol, and the picture was taken by this dude named Joe Rosenthal, and it became the inspiration for the Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C. We know now, obviously, that the picture was restaged. There's lots of, what actually happened with the picture stories. But nonetheless, this is a very, very famous image.